according to Tracy's phone. So we are going to get started. So I'm Brigham Wrinkle. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Foundation serving Southwest Colorado, and I'm so glad to see you all here. We really appreciate you joining us for this free Zoom webinar for nonprofits, Something to Chew On. We hope you grabbed your lunch, and we hope you're ready to dive into our presentation, Managing People in Pajamas, How to Successfully Build a Remote Workplace Culture. And if anybody's watching the news, we might be back at our workplace at home sooner than we think. And so it's good to be prepared and it's good to be ready. Nonprofit consultant Denise Clark joins us today to explore how we can engage our board and staff while working remotely. Discover online management resources and tools. Learn tips and tricks for the effective Zoom meetings and tackle the hard stuff too, like understanding layoffs and furloughs, and what it means for your organization and what to say and tell employees. Denise has run a nonprofit consulting practice based in Telluride and Denver and serves organizations statewide. She has 25 years of experience in the sector and is passionate about supporting nonprofit leaders. She facilitates retreats, trains boards, coaches executive directors, and connects people to resources, ideas, and each other. In her free time, Denise is probably listening to jazz, enjoying spicy food, and hiking with friends or traveling. Denise, you could open your mic. I think you have somebody you'd like to introduce as well.
Yes, I do. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to introduce Dave in just a moment. But before then, I want to just go over the Zoom norms for today, so we're all on the same page. So let's take a look. You can customize your pronouns if you so choose by clicking on the participants panel and then clicking on the blue down arrow to the right of your name. And that's where you can customize if you so choose. Attendees' videos will be off. We're using the Zoom format for webinars. Mute and unmute yourself as needed during the webinar. And for the most part, I think Brigham, you have the ability to mute and unmute as well. So we'll be helping to manage that too, just to make sure there isn't background noise. We'll be using polls throughout the webinar, and in chat, feel free to ask questions. I'll be asking you to respond to some questions in chat, make comments, and share resources. That's really a place where we can put a lot of content today. And then raise your hand. That's also in the participants panel. I may ask you occasionally to raise your hand in response to a prompt. And then reactions like thumbs up and hand clapping are not available in the Zoom webinar format. So just know that if you're looking for that, it's not there. We'll be raising our hands and using chat. And then also, if you don't want to look at the PowerPoint full screen, feel free to hit escape and you'll still be able to see the webinar and the PowerPoint, but it won't be taking up your entire screen. So that's just something that a few people have told me recently that they didn't know that they could do. All right.
So it looks
So
like we have
our guest today is Dave Knutson from Paonia. And Dave is a human resources guru, and he's been very helpful to me as a consultant in my practice. He brings strong leadership and resource experience from the private sector, local government, and working with nonprofits. He is the founder of his business called Orion Rising LLC, providing evidence-based human resource services. He teaches a leadership effectiveness training. It's a 3-day course which produces engaged, high-performing teams. He has been designated the Human Resources Professional of the Year by the Western Colorado Human Resources Association, and the Society of Human Resources Management awarded him the Pinnacle Award, which is the highest level of recognition in the HR profession. And in his free time, he lives a life, well, I guess not just his free time, but he lives a life of service, being elected twice to the board of the Outdoor Industries Conservative Alliance, serving as president and board member for the Grand Mason Nordic Council, as a branch team leader and founder of the North Fork Senior Connections, and serving on the Paonia Town Council. He competes in Nordic citizens races. He is a trail runner, a Tai Chi practitioner, and he practices Vipassana meditation. Did I say that right? I don't think I did.
No,
How do you
you did.
pronounce
You
it?
got it right. Thank you.
I did? Okay, good. Thank you. So Dave, I'm so glad that you're here, and I'll be talking about remote workplace culture, and Dave's going to really help enrich the conversation about what it means to make decisions about layoffs and furloughs and how to go about doing that. And I'm hoping that'll be really helpful to all of you.
Great.
So let's talk about.
Denise,
Yeah,
we have
Brigham.
somebody with their hand raised, Susan Ryan.
Yeah.
I'm going to allow her to talk and ask a question.
Okay, Susan.
Maybe she doesn't have a question.
Maybe she was practicing. Susan, if you have a question, feel free to put it in chat. And then for those of you trying to customize your name, it said the participants panel, you hover over the camera, a more button pops up. You click on the right arrow, it's a down arrow to the right of more, and it'll give you a chance to rename if you want to add your pronouns or change your name.
Great. And Denise, I just have one more thing announcement before we jump in
Sure,
to the program. And that is 2 organizations will win a free 1-hour consultation with Denise. Everyone who signed up gets their name put in once. At the end of the webinar, we will draw a name of our lucky winner. If you have a question and your name gets put in a second time, so you must be present to win. So here's how you can ask questions, and Denise kind of went over that, but really the chat box and the Q&A. And then during the presentation, you will also have the chance to raise your hand. We'll unmute you. Susan, if you'll just make sure you put that question you might have in the chat box, we can address that. So let's dive in. I just wanted to make sure you guys knew about the door prizes, and you have to be present to win a 1-hour consultation with Denise. And I'm going to put my mute button on.
Thanks, Brigham. So let's talk about what you will learn today. I'm going to share a model that I recently discovered called the 5 levels of distributed workers, but they've renamed it for the sake of today. We're renaming it to the 5 levels of remote work. 4 universal needs of employees, which comes from a Gallup poll that was recently conducted. Tips for building a remote workplace culture, how to approach furloughs and layoffs, and then ideas for holding engaging virtual meetings. And we're all on Zoom all the time, so I hope some of these tips will help you have fun, enjoyable meetings when you are hosting them. And even when you're not, you might be able to provide some suggestions. So I want to conduct our first poll that you will take. And the question is, what has been the biggest impact of COVID-19 on your organization? So the poll will be popping up in just a moment. And if you could please respond to this, choose 1, and then we will post the results to look at and just to discuss briefly. So what has been the biggest impact of COVID-19 on your organization?
So we've got 17. I'm going to let the poll stay over for 10 more seconds.
Okay, thanks, Brigham. Okay, it looks like 7 people responded to adapting to online or digital delivery method. And then closely behind that, an increase in services with 5 votes for that. It looks like a few of you also responded to a loss of revenue and cuts in services. So I know all of these are really important issues that are impacting nonprofits across the world. And even though none of you chose staff layoffs and furloughs, I think it's really important to be prepared in case you are faced with making those decisions. And so we will do the best that we can to prepare you for that today. So thanks so much. All right, let's talk about the La Piana survey that was conducted in May. So La Piana conducted a survey with 750 nonprofits. They've actually been doing multiple surveys, but this one had some really interesting data that I thought would be useful to share with you. So on average, respondents have had to lay off or furlough 18% of their staff. So just giving you a little bit of perspective, out of these 750, almost a fifth of the organizations have had to lay off their staff. Nearly a quarter of the respondents to the survey are considering partnerships such as a merger with another organization as a strategy for responding to the pandemic. And then 56% of respondents expect additional reductions in staff, and 55% expect to make further reductions in services. And then a couple of more data points that I thought might be useful. 91% of respondents have been forced to curtail services and adapt how they work or how they are providing their services so far. And then respondents have moved an average of 83% of their operations to a work from home arrangement. So understanding how to really create a productive, enjoyable, rewarding, and meaningful workplace culture that's remote is so important. I mean, 83% is a pretty significant amount, knowing that 750 nonprofits responded to the survey. So the 5 levels of remote work, this model's a little blurry. It's the only version that I could find, but this comes from the founder of WordPress. So his company is called Automatic, and his name is Matt Mullenweg, and he developed what he calls the 5 levels of distributed work. But for the sake of this conversation today, I found an article that adapted it to the 5 levels of remote work. So we're going to talk about that. And I'm going to turn my video off for a bit, if I can find my panel to do that. There it is, so that you don't have to look at me the whole time. You can focus on the slides. So in the top right-hand corner, there is a link to an interview of a podcast that's entitled Make Sense. And Sam Harris is the person who does that podcast, and he interviewed the founder of Automatic, or WordPress, which is, as you all know, a pretty huge thing in the world of websites. So let's just talk a little bit about each of these levels. So the first one, which is foundational, is non-deliberate action, and nothing deliberate has been done by the organization to support remote work, but employees can still keep the ball rolling somewhat if they're at home for a day or so. So they have access to their smartphone, they have access to email, and perhaps they dial into a few meetings. So this is really basic remote work. The second level, recreating the office online, this is where most organizations now reside. So be thinking about whether or not this is where your nonprofit is. It's when your employees have access to, like what we're using today, video conferencing, Zoom, or instant messaging such as Slack and email. But instead of redesigning the work to take advantage of the new medium, teams are ultimately just recreating online what they've been doing in the office all along. So if you're at level 2, you still have a ways to go to building a remote workplace culture. And then level 3 is adapting to the medium. This is when organizations start to adapt and take advantage of the medium of working remotely. Mullenweg points to shared documents, such as using Google Docs or Google Drive, that are visible to all and updated in real time during a discussion, so that there is a shared understanding of what is being discussed and decided. And this eliminates the risk of what would be considered like lost in translation errors and any time wasted. And so this past week, I conducted 2 days of strategic planning, and we used Google Docs, broke into small groups using breakout sessions. And the groups were able to type directly into the Google Docs. They came back to the full group and shared it. It was real time for every single participant. So figuring out a way to utilize that so that people can actually be sharing and looking at the documents at the same time is one of the things that he's suggesting at this level is being done. And it's at this stage, level 3, that organizations start to invest in better equipment for their employees, such as lighting for video calls and background noise canceling microphones, which some of you may have already invested in. And then asynchronous communication, asynchronous meaning not existing or happening at the same time. This is the I'll get to it when it suits me form of communication. So the reality is most things don't require an immediate response. And for some things, a one-way email or an instant message should do the job with the recipient responding when it suits them. But these forms of communication have to be clearly articulated and agreed upon within your staff. So if something is really urgent, then the mode of communication should reflect that. You want to pick up the phone. If you can, tap the person on the shoulder. I'm not sure if that's really possible now, but only if it's truly urgent. So being able to decide what methods of communication you're using for urgent versus non-urgent is really important in the remote workplace. And then level 5, the tip of the pyramid, is nirvana. And this is where your distributed team works better than any other team ever could. This level places emphasis on environmental design around organizational culture and the environment in which people work. So I don't know if very many organizations or companies have gotten to nirvana, but that's ultimately where we're headed. And then one thing that I wanted to mention just about workplace culture and thinking about different levels and what's happening with your staff is Sabrina Sturwalt, who's an astrophysicist, was recently quoted in Scientific America that several studies have found about 30 to 40% of the population are night owls, which means that the modern 9-to-5 workday is sabotaging the creative and intellectual efforts of almost half the workforce. So if you're not a night owl, but you have night owl employees, I just think it's more important than ever working remotely that we take into consideration what it might mean to be flexible with employees that are not necessarily getting up at 6 in the morning. And I will tell you that I am one of them. I work late at night. Sometimes I'm working in the middle of the night. It's when I feel most productive, but it just depends on what is called your chronotype. So I want to do another poll. And quickly, what is your chronotype, which is your sleeping pattern? I'm just curious, based on all of you who are here today, where the majority of you land. And middle of the road just basically means I'm not either. I kind of go back and forth.
So we have 20 people out of 26 so far. I'll leave the poll open for 5 more seconds.
Interesting. So it looks like the majority of you, 50%, or half of you, I guess, are middle of the road. 36%, 8 of you are early risers, and then 3 of you are my people, night owls. So it's good to know. And I just think you may already know this about your employees, but it's good to just ask and take into consideration about how 9 to 5 may not work for someone, but 10 to 7 could work for someone, or 12 to 8, and whether or not you have the ability to be flexible. All right, just a little curiosity on my part, and wanted to see what you all where you land, and just to encourage you to think about that. So let's talk about remote work. So COVID-19 has, for the time being, transformed our relationship with technology. Almost overnight, nonprofits had to make the move to remote work and take as many programs online as they could. And you all talked about this or responded to this as one of your biggest concerns or impacts since the pandemic started in the first poll that we did today. So nonprofits are finding tech solutions to connect with clients, provide critical services, engage with lawmakers, etc. Some organizations have discovered that working remotely has actually increased productivity and collaboration, which is a tremendous outcome. So I'm not sure if you're having that experience, but it is something that I'm seeing more and more in nonprofits. And I assume that because you're here, you're either managing people remotely, you're working remotely yourself, or both. So when the pandemic first started, I don't know about you, but I thought I was going to be working at my kitchen table for a few weeks. And obviously that has changed. And our remote work practices are likely to continue into the foreseeable future. So Gallup, the polling company, has been conducting lots of polls since the pandemic started. And one of the things that they found out recently was that virtual work now accounts for 62% of the workforce. And I assume that this might even be higher. I think this poll was conducted in August. It's just increasingly going up, and knowing that we're having different mandates and restrictions and that there's an increase in cases. I anticipate that this will continue to increase. So prior to the pandemic, in 2017, there was a research study conducted that predicted by 2027 that the majority of the US workforce will be working remotely online. So we're moving toward that during the next 10 years or so, but we're moving at a much faster clip because of the pandemic. So Gallup also discovered 4 universal needs of employees. And I want you to think about these if you're a manager especially. So how are these needs being met at your organization? So the reality is that our organizations that we once connected frequently in person, and we had water cooler chats, we had meetings in conference rooms, we went out to lunch, all of that has really changed. And now we're dispersed and working individually in uncertain and in an uncertain and evolving climate. So Gallup's research revealed these 4 universal truths. The first one is that employees need hope. They need excitement about a better future. They need trust. They need to believe that the words that they hear will connect with actions. They need compassion, understanding of others, of how they feel, what is on their mind, and knowing that you are listening to them. And they need stability. Employees want to know some things will be consistent, even in times of immense change and disruption. So leaders should always find ways to weave these messages, to be acknowledging and lifting up these needs, like making sure that within your communications, within your narrative as a manager, that you are addressing hope, trust, compassion, and stability. So just put these on your radar and think about what you're doing to actually incorporate these into how you're managing your team. I think the pandemic is providing an opportunity for managers to establish new ways of working with their staff, new rituals, new practices and patterns, new methods of communication, new partnerships, new collaborations. So in offices, this happens organically, but in the new remote work environment, managers need to step in and proactively establish structures and new ways of working. This could include virtual team lunches and celebrations, brainstorming and whiteboarding, video-based check-ins, and using internal check-ins to learn more about work and personal needs, where you're actually conducting one-on-ones internally with your staff members. And then knowing most of us are working remotely right now, I want to talk about how to establish a remote workplace culture. So I've developed 6 tips through doing a lot of research and trying to find what I thought would be most useful to you all today. But before we do that, I'd love for you to put in chat, when I talk about new ways of working, so kind of adapting in-person strategies, in-person practices to the virtual environment, what are some things that you all have done? So just quickly, like one thing that you've done to adapt, or what you might consider to be a new way of working. So I'd love to see where you all are at. So put in chat what you consider to be new ways. So leveraging Microsoft Teams, great. Virtual board meetings, moving to registrations for our youth choir, fully online, using Slack. I'm so glad Sarah, I'm really glad you're using Slack. And then Jerry, I would love at some point for you to chime in. Let me get a little further along and then we might take you off of mute so you can add to that. Katie mentioned virtual one-on-one check-ins. I'm going to be providing a link to a one-on-one check-in agenda that the Management Center has created that I think you'll find really interesting. Getting creative, I like that. Using whiteboard spaces. I'm not familiar with Miro or Miro. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Virtual events. Great, it looks like a lot of you are doing and texting. Of course, texting back and forth is a really great way to get quick communications that don't require a lot of discussion. All right, thanks for participating and sharing all those great ideas. I'm gonna save the chat and it may be something that we want to make available. I'm not sure how that works exactly, but we'll see. All right. Oh, here's the question. Sorry, I meant to pull that up. My bad. So let's talk about the 6 tips to rebuild a remote workplace culture. So these are the 6 tips. I'm going to discuss each of these in detail. So just take a quick glance at these before I move on. There's a woman working in pajamas and slippers. Many of you may be in pajamas and slippers today. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the way that we are working now. We can be more comfortable. Okay, so the first tip is to recreate your physical workday virtually. So when faced with a difficult situation, the best leaders take the opportunity to regroup or build a better version. So my hope for you all is that you'll build an even stronger workplace culture by building a strong remote workplace culture. So that by being very intentional, trying some new things, that in the end, when the pandemic is behind us, we will have an even stronger workplace culture when we're back in person. So if employees are suddenly working from home, and it requires implementing new staff protocols, including how to communicate and support each other, how to work more effectively, and even fun stuff like virtual coffee breaks and happy hours. So I want you to think about the following things. Think about your morning hello. How is everybody being greeted? What are you doing to start your day? Think about daily check-ins. I'll be, like I said, in just a little bit, putting a link in chat to a really great tool that you can use to structure your check-ins with employees. Think about water cooler talks. Even if you don't have a water cooler, maybe people convene in somebody's office or cubicle or your kitchen or a picnic table outside, whatever it might be. Steve Jobs used to talk about the importance of serendipitous personal encounters. So how can you create that in a virtual space? And then create a hangout space where people can just jump in and take a break from their work. And perhaps they'll be doing that simultaneously and they'll be able to just chat, debrief, check in with a coworker. And then Slack actually has a water cooler channel. And Sarah, maybe you can say more about this. Perhaps you're using it at Crow Canyon, but this basically gives you an opportunity to get together using Slack in what they're calling a water cooler space. So if you use Slack, or I'm very curious, I know this is becoming so popular with organizations, put a +1 in chat if you're currently using Slack. I'd love to see how popular it is with all of you here today. And Donna put meet at a shady park with lawn chairs, distance so we can talk without masks. I love it. I facilitate a couple of ED peer groups, and that's how we've been meeting all summer. It's been really nice. So let's talk about schedules and hours. We want to be flexible and not expect that our employees' hours will be exactly the same as they were when we were in the office. I already mentioned what this might look like for early risers and night owls. Block off time in your calendar to indicate when you'll be working and have your staff do the same. You all need to know where each other is if you're not doing a traditional 9 to 5. Aim to have a significant chunk of overlap, like 4 to 5 hours between your schedules each day. So this may be a little bit like putting together a puzzle or playing Tetris or something, but figuring out how you can be in the office at the same time, the virtual office, but you may also have some time that you're working alone, or maybe there's only a couple of people in the office. Think about your employees' desks, their workspaces, and technology. Not everybody has equal access to the internet. It's definitely revealing the inequities that we experience in rural communities or in certain populations that don't have access to this level of technology. So it's really thinking about our digital literacy and what we can do to support our employees to be digitally literate. So ensure that all your employees have what they need to work productively from home, and invest in what employees need to be successful. So this may be not in your current budget, but be thinking about 2021 and whether or not you can or need to be budgeting for supporting your employees working remotely. And then how do we work and support each other as a team? Set up Zoom co-working sessions. This I relate to, remember when we used to have to do study halls in high school? I don't know, at least I did. And we would get together and we would all study Often we weren't allowed to talk to each other, so this isn't that strict, but set up these co-working sessions for your employees to hop on for an hour to let each other know what you're focusing on, what your priorities are, and then maybe at the end of the hour, just check in with each other and see what kind of progress has been made. So it's just more of a way of feeling like you're working together versus in isolation. And then don't forget the donuts or whatever treats your staff members like. It may be that you're delivering treats door to door someday just to say thank you and to lift the spirits of your employees. So the second tip for establishing a effective workplace culture remotely is setting engagement and expectation boundaries. So even if everyone on your team becomes a Slack wizard or finally figures out how to unmute their mute button in Zoom, it's not business as usual. So we need to understand when we're expected to log in and actually be at work. Everyone on your team needs to know when to contact you and how to contact you and each other. When can employees or your coworkers expect a response from you? And when is your virtual door closed? I think it's really important to be able to say, I'm on deadline from 9 to 10 on Wednesday, October 21st. Don't contact me unless it's urgent, and I will, urgent means text me. So, and then you all have to define what urgent means because it means different things for different people. And here are some tools that you can use to do this. So Calendly, Google Calendar, iCal, Microsoft Outlook. I'm sure many of you are already using one or more of these. And then setting engagement, expectations, and boundaries continued. Here are a couple of ways that you might be able to word scheduling time on your own, and so that you have focus time. So in order to be incredibly focused and productive, I will be checking my emails twice a day this week. You can instant message me an immediate response. So if you need an immediate response, so maybe you're using Slack or maybe you're using text, however you would want to word this, just let people know what you're doing. And then due to my personal life balance, I will remain, or I often will be emailing outside of normal work hours, but please don't feel any pressure to respond outside of your own working pattern. So it's just letting people know. So this may be that it's an ongoing expectation or an ongoing boundary, or it may just be a special occasion due to something that you're trying to get done during a specific week or a specific month. So just be really clear on what this looks like. And it may be every Monday, you're defining this. Every employee is defining what this means, and everybody honors it so that you're working productively together. And then Dave's going to pop on a little bit and talk about engagement. He has a formula that he uses called significance plus involvement equals engagement. And Dave, I'd love it if you could say just a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to simplify just how people reinforce engagement in workplaces. And this comes from working in a variety of settings, but primarily, how do you, as an individual that has direct reports, really foster a climate for engagement? And I've thought from my own experience and from hearing from multiple others, one of the key things is significance. People have to know, and a lot of you work in nonprofits, so of course your purpose of your organization, that brings people with a lot of significance because we have significance in the work we're doing. And so reinforcing that significance of the workplace as a whole, but also reinforcing individual significance, recognizing, looking for the contributions that people are making and giving them positive feedback about that. So that's part of significance. The second thing is involvement, and I'm sure all of you have had experience where a policy change or a culture change has been made that drastically affects your work, and you've had no input into that decision. So involvement really gets at trying to remind you that try to think of who is impacted by a decision you're ready to make and seek input on that. That doesn't mean they necessarily get a vote, but they've been given a heads up. You've talked to them about it in advance. You've listened to what they have to say, so they feel involved. It's not a surprise. So engagement is really those two facets are really huge. Significance, letting them know how they're making a difference, and involvement and pulling them into decision making. So I hope that helps.
It does help. Thank you, Dave. It's a really brilliant equation that I could memorize. So thanks. I think it's a good one to just consider. It may even be something that you could talk about at a staff meeting. Like, what does significance look like on our team? What does involvement look like? How are we doing? Where are we falling short? So be thinking about how you can use that around setting engagement, expectations, and boundaries during the remote workplace environment, or in the remote workplace environment. So recently I was reading about workplace kind of principles or guidelines, and I found these and I want to share them with you. And I would love it if you want to guess where I found these. You can put it in chat, but I thought they were really incredible. So the first one is, you are not working from home, you are working at home during a crisis. The second one, your personal, physical, mental, and emotional health are far more important than anything else right now. Don't try to compensate for lost productivity by working longer hours. Be kind to yourself and do not judge how you are coping based on how you see others coping. Be kind to others and do not judge how they are coping based on how you are coping. And then our team's success will not be measured the same way it was when things were normal. So any guesses on where I came across these? And it's kind of a wild guess. I don't really expect anyone to guess it, but I'm just curious if any of you have either seen these or heard of these. So this is a kind of broadly stated around workplace employees' care and well-being. And the guidelines around engagement, expectations, and boundaries may be more specific and even individualized, but these came from the Canadian government. So in May, the Canadian government established these for all their employees. Yay, Canada. Like, I don't know, I just think it says a lot about how their government functions and treats its employees. But doing something like this with your staff, it might even be a fun exercise to take a look at these and then create some for your own organization. All right, we're going to take another poll. So has your organization established a set of guiding principles for working remotely during the pandemic? So this is just yes or no, and then if you're not quite there and you're in process, please let us know that. I really think it's hard to do this without having something in writing. We are going to make a lot of assumptions and probably a lot of mistakes. So I really want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to consider putting some things in writing about what your workplace culture means, what it looks like, what people are expected to do.
So we have 21 people voted, 91% have voted so far. I'll give you 2 more seconds. There you go.
Great. So it looks like the majority of you have not yet done this. I don't want to add another thing to your plate. I know how busy you are, but I'll be providing, along with the slides from today, a really great remote workplace guidebook that'll help you be able to think through how to do this. And it's just something that it may take a few conversations, but even if you just have a couple of pages of things, principles in writing that you're actually acknowledging and following, and everyone is aware of what that is, and you can hold each other accountable, I think it can really be helpful. So yes, I'm asking you to write some things down and take some time to do it, but the results in the long term, or the benefits in the long term, will be great. All right, let's talk about streaming your internal communications. So when you're communicating with your employees, the challenge is how to get the right information to the right people. You can't copy the entire staff on an email or on every email, but sometimes it feels like that's what it takes to make sure everyone is on the same page. So as a part of your guidelines, perhaps you can clarify when to use email, when to use messaging apps, when to use your phone, when to text, when a video call is important. So just clarifying the different methods and what that means for different types of communication that you have within your organization internally. And then identify the channels really be super clear on what does it mean to have an emergency or an urgent communication, and how will you be communicating that. So here, whoops, sorry, I meant to go, whoops, back. Sorry about that. There are some different tools that you can use to do this. They're similar to the ones that I've mentioned earlier. You can use Slack, you can use text, you can use email. You may be using Microsoft Teams, like somebody here mentioned that they're using at their organization. Many of you may be using Microsoft Teams. So just getting clear on what this looks like, having conversations about it and putting it in writing. And then when you think about groups, when it comes to streamlining your internal communication, I suggest that you hop on a call at some point at the beginning of the day. If you have people starting at different times, maybe at the beginning of when you all overlap, and just doing a 10 to 15 minute check-in about what are everybody's priorities for the day? What are your goals? What are people hoping to accomplish on this particular day? And then toward the end of the day, when everyone is still on in the virtual environment, do another 10 to 15 minute check-in. How has the day gone? So you're bringing everyone together just like you would in your office, so that you're really clear and you're supporting each other. It may be that something that I'm working on one day, I need somebody else's help. So that needs to be clearly communicated. And then as far as individuals, there's a really awesome check-in tool that I'm going to put in chat. So I'm going to have to minimize my screen and grab it for you. But I've mentioned the Management Center before in this webinar environment. And the Management Center has incredible free tools for you all to use to manage your employees, to create positive organizational cultures. So this is a check-in agenda template that will structure how you actually do check-ins with individual employees, and it may even help you with your group check-ins. So just make sure that if you are doing these check-ins, that there's some structure and consistency in how you're doing them versus just showing up willy-nilly with your first cup of coffee and doing a check-in. Be really strategic and intentional about how you're structuring them. No, the check-in agenda link I just put in chat. So Marcy, if you could look in chat, it's there. So you can cut and paste from the chat panel. I hope that helps. Okay, so going back, great. So streamlining your communications. And the last thing that I want to mention is get creative. So connect in ways that may not seem obvious, but use photos. The other day I was working with a group and I asked them to all take pictures of the shoes that they were wearing and then to send them in. And so we did that, and we just laughed. Like, some people were in slippers, some people were barefoot. It was just sort of a fun way to like break the ice and the monotony of working and looking at online and looking at Zoom. You can ask people to share quotes, hold up their cats, or conduct contests. Like, maybe there's a way that you can actually make something competitive amongst your team. So the bottom line is you want to get creative and you want to be really clear on how you're communicating internally. So I'm curious, there have been studies that have been conducted that remote employees often feel shunned and they feel less significant. And that was when we had in-person and workplace environments. But now that we're all going to workplace primarily, I'm wondering what you think you might be able to do so your employees feel like they have value and they don't feel shunned. So just be thinking about what that might look like at your organization. The fourth tip for establishing a successful remote workplace culture is not letting your out-of-sight employees become out-of-mind employees. So Harvard Business School professor Michael Beer reminds us that, oops, sorry, I've got the wrong slide. I gotta turn my page. Pre-COVID-19, I talked about the research that's being conducted about shunned. So remember the daily check-in, ask your employees how their day was, and then connect using creative techniques. I didn't go through this slide. And then I wanted to ask you to put in chat, what are you doing to make sure that your employees don't feel shunned? So I want you to think about that and maybe even talk about it with your team. So ask employees, what level of significance do they feel like they're bringing to the organization in this virtual workplace environment? Chat about it and ask them for some suggestions on how they could feel like they're being valued the same way that they're being valued in the in-person workplace culture. So stick and chat and see what they, let's see, Brigham put a playlist, deliver s'more supplies. That's great. Yoga online, together to start doing yoga online together to start the workday. Start a list of fun things like a book list or a Netflix list, or a podcast or a favorite hike or a favorite recipe. Those are all great ideas. I'm totally stealing those from you, Brigham. Those are great. All right. So if you have any other ideas, please put these in chat. I'm going to save them, and I'm hoping that we can send some of the chat content to all of you to be able to reference later. Okay, so being intentional about building trust. So this is so key to not working in the same office and being able to read body language, see facial expressions, give hugs, whatever we do to build trust amongst our team members. So I think I would love to know what you all do to build trust, but I really think that we have to figure out the best way to communicate that trust is being earned, or that trust actually exists. So as I mentioned earlier, Michael Beer, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, he says that management needs as much information as possible to ensure that employees are able to execute their jobs. So in short, a well-functioning organization necessitates a culture of open communication in which employees feel comfortable telling management what is and isn't working. So having these open conversations as much as possible. And then research shows that remote workers are often nervous and even experience feelings such as fear and paranoia when they're not able to interact with people face to face. So this obviously just stems from the body language, facial expressions that I mentioned earlier, just the things that we do in our normal day-to-day in-person workplaces. So when you lack clear and explicit communication from your supervisor or as you're giving to your team about expectations and goals, some employees may actually experience feelings of fear and paranoia. And then this is when rumors start, there's mistrust, and then people just are behaving badly, possibly behind the scenes because they're talking with each other about these feelings versus really working it out at the level of full team engagement. And then virtual employees also, to combat this fear, you may want to err on the side of over communication. So this means that you schedule mandatory phone calls or face-to-face interaction on a regular basis. And then remote workers share again that one of the best managers that they have in the workplace environment that is virtual is managers that check in frequently. So we want to use video conferencing technology, even though I know we're all really zoomed out, but making sure that we're figuring out a way to check in frequently, whatever that might mean for each employee. It could look a little different. It might mean a walk if you're in the same town. It may mean a phone call. It may mean that you're actually Zooming with someone a couple times a week so that you can see each other and make eye contact. So you want to tailor your communication to the convenience of each employee. So make sure that what you're doing, you're not doing the exact same thing for everybody, because it really will be different depending upon the personality and the work style of each employee. So consider co-creating a set of trust building ideas. So meeting with your team and thinking through what are ways that they find trust to be built successfully in the workplace and incorporating those. So what are some ways that you all are currently building trust with your team? So this may be some things that you were doing when you were in the in-person workplace. Some of you may still be in the in-person workplace, but what are some things that you have done? So put in chat that you have found successful in creating and building trust on your team. I'd love to know what you are doing. Jerry says, staying in touch with our staff during our sabbatical, met in safe places to brainstorm, holding conference calls, thanking them for their accomplishments more than before, and taking time to ask sincerely, how are you? I love that. That is the simple check-in that is so powerful and really meaning it, like you said, Jerry. Virtual check-ins, great, Katie, thank you. Anyone else? Oh, good. One-on-one check-ins at least once a week. Definitely social distance meetups. So I think the thing that I'm hoping will happen with everyone sharing and being able to save these chat ideas is that you'll get some new ideas on what you might be able to do at your workplace. Maybe you're feeling validated today as I work through some of this content. Whatever it may be, I'm hoping that this can help you be more intentional and include your entire team on how to build a more successful remote workplace and how to build trust. All right, let's talk about institutionalizing rewards and recognition. So most employees want to feel valued and recognized for their hard work. Even if we're managers, we want to feel recognized and valued for our hard work. For example, if we're executive directors by our boards. And your in-person office culture probably supported these opportunities to make people feel valued and to recognize your staff. In a remote work setting, all of these small cheers and accolades that happen naturally in the in-person office environment easily evaporate. So there's just not necessarily the organic, the chance, the organic opportunity, or kind of that flow of what might happen where you're high-fiving someone in the office. So think about your employees glued to their screens, working toward the next deadline. After a while, even the largest accomplishments might be met with little energy or response. So because of this, we inadvertently create a culture that suppresses applause and recognition. So incorporate into your team meetings an opportunity for staff to share accolades and to show appreciation for each other. It may make your meetings a little bit longer, but it'll be well worth the time. And then the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance recently created a recognition statement, which is something you may want to do as a way to institutionalize this applause that I'm talking about. It indicates that all employees need to take the time to celebrate their accomplishments, no matter how big or small. And this is what they wrote. It's just one sentence. We appreciate each other and we find the time to recognize our hard work and efforts. This is both structured, planned recognition, but also informal, in the moment applause. So thinking about how you're actually recognizing and awarding your employees for good work, making sure you're not letting this fall to the wayside. Some other things that you might want to do, I know a lot of great ideas were shared, but I think ordering coffee or lunch to be delivered to your staff, encouraging them to get out of the office and to go for walks, to exercise and to take breaks. So I like to go to a 9 o'clock yoga class. Let's say that I'm working a 9-to-5 job. Maybe my employer would allow me a few times a week to take that 9 o'clock yoga class and to start work an hour later. So figuring out ways that you can incorporate useful awarding or rewarding activities for your staff to do, both as a group and as a staff. And then showing grace. I just think it's so important to make sure that we give people a lot of space right now to do their work. It's not the same as it was. So let's talk about some definitions. These are definitions that we'll be using during the conversation that I'm having with Dave today. And I think you all know what these mean, but I just wanted to make sure that we were on the same page about the difference between a furlough, a layoff, and a reduction in force. So furloughs are alternatives to layoffs, and workers are mandated to work fewer hours and to take unpaid leave, but they keep their jobs. So some of you may have needed to furlough employees. I'm curious how many of you have needed to either furlough or lay off. So if you could put a +1 if you've had to do that at your organization. If you're not there yet, that's great. I hope you don't get there. But this conversation will help prepare you for that time if it does come. Layoffs are a temporary separation from payroll. And an employee is laid off because there's not enough work to perform, but they can be recalled to work again when more work becomes available. And then a reduction in force is when a position is eliminated without the intention of replacing it. and involves a permanent cut in headcount. A layoff may turn into a reduction in force if work doesn't again become available, but it isn't automatically a reduction in force when you lay someone off. So it looks like we've got one person who's had to furlough. There's somebody probably, I'm not sure if you're in Durango, Bonnie, but possibly a downtown business that is closing at the end of the month. So just a couple of you so far. Well, I think the conversation that I'm going to have with Dave will be really helpful for those of you that have either already done this, thinking about how you conducted the process, or if it is something that your organization might face because we are in such an uncertain place. So Dave, welcome. I'd really love to ask you a few questions so you can talk about what you know about doing this.
Okay, it shows stop video, but I'm not seeing video on my screen. Are you seeing me?
I can see you. Can everyone else see Dave?
Okay, great.
Okay, great.
I'm here.
So Dave, let's talk about alternatives to layoffs. So we know that payroll is the biggest cost to most of our organizations. And when we look at how a lot of us are facing a decrease in income, which some organizations here today responded to in one of the polls, our knee-jerk reaction is often that we just start laying people off, that we cut positions, because that will be a big money saver for us. But should we really go there that fast when we're looking at a decrease in revenue?
Well, you know, one of the things I'm thinking about with this remote thing is how much physical space do we really need? And a lot of organizations are not really looking at, do we really need this office? Do we need to pay this rent? Can we sell this building? Whatever it might be. There's other ways to be able to cut instead of just cutting payroll. One of the problems with looking at payroll is, of course, you're starting to cut into people. And I don't know the size of the organizations we're dealing with today. Part of what I'm going to be talking about is geared toward organizations that have several employees, and you have to make decisions about which ones stay and which ones go. As far as alternatives, though, a lot of times people don't think about, well, you know, some of our people may want to take a break and sail around the world and be offline for a year, or they might want to do this through hiking for a month or 2 months, and they would be glad to be off payroll for a month or two. So extending leaves of absences generously could be one way to avoid immediately having to lay off. You could ask people about early retirements. One of the things a lot of organizations are very reluctant to do when it comes close to layoff time is take care of your poor performers. A lot of times people kick the can down the road with poor performers, and they don't have heart-to-heart discussions about whether that person should be staying with the organization or not. So what the things you can do right away is making sure you're culling people that are holding the organization back and checking in with people about how they could help.
So let's say that we can't do any of these alternatives. Even I think they're great ones, but
Yeah.
what if those alternatives aren't really, they're not a reality for our organization or for our employees?
Yeah.
And we wind up having to lay off staff. How do we do that? Like, what does that process look like? I think there are plenty of people here who've been managing people for a lot of years who've never had to do that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times we're kind of caught in the swirl of needing to cover those payroll costs, and we don't have enough time to sit down and say, well, who is going to make the decision? How are we going to communicate that decision? I think it's really important that you're clear with the organization, with your board of directors, about how those decisions will be made. Executive directors can get undermined by their board of directors if they're not making decisions and they're not attached to the hip at the board of directors. There's too many close relationships in there between employees and the board that could come back to bite you. So be clear about how the decision is going to be made, who are going to be the decision makers, and making sure you're bringing your board along with you as you do that. The communication plan is really huge, though. And one of the things that's often overlooked, and this is more for organizations that are much larger, But if you have very high contributors, one organization that I was in, the leaders went to the high contributors and told us, you are not eligible for a layoff. You are staying here. Now that's very reassuring to some people, but it helps reduce the anxiety. So being clear about who this is not going to affect and communicating that to them, it can lower the anxiety. One thing that's really interesting is the stress levels that happen with a layoff. You would think that the highest stress levels to the people that are being laid off, but actually that's not the case. In my experience, the highest stress is for the person who has to deliver the message. That is really huge. Next highest stress, and this might surprise many of you, tends to be those that are left behind, because they feel like the ground is shaking underneath them. There's a lot of uncertainty. They see other people lose their jobs. And so their stress level goes up. The person who's being laid off, I'm not denigrating the fact that they have stress. They obviously have a lot of stress, yet they have a path forward. They know what's happening to them. There's some amount of certainty that a person that's not getting laid off doesn't have. So those are some of the thoughts about thinking about it in advance.
Those are really good tips. I'm wondering, I'm thinking about performance data, and like some nonprofits that I work with, they don't conduct performance evaluations. They don't necessarily have data on how well certain employees are doing.
Mhm.
What kind of data do nonprofits need, and how do they use that data to make these layoff decisions, even in small organizations?
Mhm. Yeah, the thing that's really tough about the performance data, it has to be pretty solid. One of the organizations I worked with had a very tight contribution ranking process they did every 6 months, and it was numerical. And they asked for input from the employees, and they went off of that contribution ranking in order to determine layoffs. And they said 10% of the list, those are the ones we're laying off. Well, that's easy in a big organization that's done all that stuff in advance. Even if you do reviews, if the reviews are not, could I say, solidly based in facts and are more opinion or more coaching type of reviews, that gets a little more dicey. I think it's best to try and look at the who are the last ones hired, who are the next ones, the first ones to go out. That's a last in, first out kind of philosophy. Keeps you out of trouble. In my years, I've had 2 lawsuits come up from layoffs. One was the layoff of a person who was over 55. The other one was a layoff of a woman who was pregnant at the time of the layoffs. And in both of those cases, we had good performance data, and the case didn't proceed. But performance data aside, you really have to look at what are the needs of the organization, if nothing else. And this is what's true for smaller organizations. Smaller organizations look at, okay, what's ahead of us? What are the positions that are really key? And documenting those decisions, laying off the people that aren't as key to where you're trying to go.
Great, that's really helpful. So, yeah, I wish I would have known all this when I was an executive director. Where were you then? So now, okay, let's say we do have to make a layoff decision. We've used performance data. What does it look like? Can you just kind of walk through the process, the communication plan that you mentioned a few moments ago?
Yeah, I know one thing that I've been really big on over time with my clients is saying, look, make sure you're communicating with your high performers right away and letting them know this is coming down the pike and seeking input from them, ideas, alternatives, what they think could be done. One of the things that's really, I think, falls by the wayside with a lot of people is when you're ready to lay off people, who is the best person to deliver the message? And in a lot of cases, you try to think of who are the people that have the strongest relationships with that individual. Hopefully, it's their manager or their supervisor. And there could be one other person in the room. 2 people aren't always necessary, but if you have a sense that the layoff is going to be tricky or difficult, or you're going to get a lot of pushback, I think it's a good idea to have two people in the room to deliver the message. One thing that's really clear when you're face to face with the person you're laying off, the more you can design giving them choices, the better off you are. So, just as an example, if you're offering a severance package of some sort, what do they have control over? Can they choose? Do they want to be paid throughout that severance period, or do they want a lump sum check in the beginning? Let them know how long you're offering medical insurance if you have it, how long you can do that during the severance period. So there's some things where as much control as you can leave in the hands of the person who is being laid off. One example would be, how do you want to say goodbye to people? When do you want to clean out your desk? How do you want to deliver the message to your family? Would it be helpful if I wrote you a letter of recommendation? Those kind of things where they have choice is really, really important. The second thing, and this is in the face-to-face, I've started that meeting, and this may sound a little harsh, but I've started the meeting a lot of times with, you probably know why we're meeting today. And I am quiet and I listen, because that's when they start talking. And that's a thing that's really key in those face-to-face layoff things. Besides giving the person choices, being ready to listen and not having to fill the room with your own talking. A lot of us are used to doing that. That's why we're leaders. And I discourage that. This is the time to shift gears and really listen to the person and give them the airtime. The other thing of the communication that a lot of people don't get, and this is where I think in the many furloughs that I've been involved in, we've been really successful. We circle back with the person after a week with at least a phone call or a check-in saying, how are you doing? Is there anything you need from us? Those kind of things that just communicate that concern. So don't just think of it as one and done, and that I've talked to them, I told them lay off, we filled out the paperwork. And I want to talk about layoff paperwork too, because that can get really complex with some of the forms you have to fill out. Sometimes I leave that till the very end or follow up later with it, because you have to let the reality set in with the person. So I hope that gives you some of the ideas of how to conduct that one-on-one.
Yeah, it definitely does. One question that I have to clarify, the choices that you're talking about presenting, is that something that you give the employee in writing and then you give them a certain amount of time to make a decision? They're not being asked to make a decision in that moment about severance or when they.
Yeah, that's a lot of tough things. And that also gives you an opportunity to follow up the next day. So it says, why don't you think about these things, talk to your family about it, see what you want, and then get back with me tomorrow.
Dave, a question came in from Katie about, in nonprofits, sometimes staff positions are funded by grants.
Mhm.
And knowing that we're in a pretty unstable, especially government grant environment right now,
Right.
do you have any tips for what it might be to have those conversations that are, it's really not about performance, it's not necessarily about a decrease in funding that's due to loss of individual donors. It's really about like a single grant that might, or a couple of grants that might be funding someone's position.
It's not as difficult a decision or a conversation to have when those are the cases. I think most people that work in positions that are grant funded, when you're hiring them, you're letting them know it's funded by a grant, I would hope. But sometimes you haven't. And so having those conversations early, I think, is really, really important, getting ahead of it instead of behind it. But let's say you haven't communicated that well. It's another difficult decision. So the principles are still there as far as giving them as much choice as you can, or at least being willing to listen.
So with the grant funded positions, is it not a good idea to let an employee know that they might be able to come back if the position is refunded? I mean, I'm just thinking about these conversations and what we might tend to say that
Sure.
may not be a good idea.
Yeah, these are not easy conversations to have. I hate to make promises about people coming back that I don't know if I can fulfill. I mean, it's a tough reality, and I think being honest is more important than trying to be hopeful, should I say.
Thank you. So let's say that we have to make a layoff. We have the conversation one-on-one. We've followed some of the steps and tips that you've outlined for us. What happened, like, besides the following up a week later, or what happens next?
Well, a lot of people don't think about the people that are left behind, and I think that's a problem. You have to be communicating with staff about, is this going to happen again? How are we doing financially? Keeping them in the loop. And this is part of that whole formula that I talked about earlier about significance and involvement. You know, people need to feel reassured that they're making a difference. They need to be involved in decisions. That's part of the communication process.
Thank you. Do you have any final words that you want to share about layoffs and furloughs and what's happening in our world, but especially in the nonprofit sector with so many organizations who've never been faced with making these decisions?
Yeah, I think the thing that's really hard is tapping into resources for people. I had the luxury of working for a company that could actually afford outplacement services. And those outplacement services can be really helpful in helping the person find another job. I know workforce services is slammed right now, and sometimes you're able to use them to help the person to find the job. But I doubt very seriously if they have the capacity to do that, given what's happening right now. But I have used outplacement services in the past. It's really worth the bang for the buck. The main thing you're after here is trying to stay out, keep a good relationship and keep the organization reputation intact. But also you want to stay out of court on this whole thing. And so that's why I've been stressing the communication, the listening, the follow-up, all those types of things.
You had shared with me when we talked a while ago some resources from SHRM, which that acronym is it? I don't know.
Society. Yeah, it's for
SCHRM?
Society for Human Resource Management, and
Yeah.
it's a professional organization for HR people. But I think a lot of executive directors, it's worth the 150 or so membership fee to be joining them, because they have a plethora of white papers and layoff information and protocols and toolkits and things like that that are really helpful. Writing job descriptions, doing performance reviews, all those kind of things can be really helpful to people. Unfortunately, a lot of that is only accessible to members, and so joining might be worthwhile.
So it's, I'm going to put it in chat. Will you tell me this is the right? It's SHRM. Okay.
Mhm.
Many of you may be familiar with SHRM's resources, but I think between SHRM and the Management Center, and then of course, just Googling randomly, seeing what you can find, there are lots of good resources to support you. Donna brings up a really good point in chat. She says that losing good talent is tough when the person laid off will likely look for a job elsewhere. Not easy to let them go. And I really think that's what's happening with nonprofits right now. It's a very different type of layoff than when it's just grounded in performance.
Sure. And that's really difficult. You just hate to see that. It's like cutting off your arm or cutting off your nose to spite your face, because these are high contributors that you've lost. And if they are high contributors, they're probably going to find another job in this climate.
Well, I really appreciate you joining us today. You have such an amazing background and amount of experience to bring to this conversation. So thanks for joining us. And as I continue and we start to kind of wrap things up, if there's anything else that comes to mind that you want to share, just come off mute and pop on in.
Okay. Thanks, Denise.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Dave. So I want to talk about holding engaging virtual meetings, because we're in so many of them right now. And it sounds like some of you have started to get really creative. But there's a quote from Dave Barry that comes from quite a few years ago, but I still think it applies to today, which is, if you had to identify in one word the reason why the human race has not achieved and never will achieve its full potential, that word would be meetings. So not only were we faced with this when we were sitting around a table together, but we're really faced with it now. in the virtual world. So here are some tips for holding virtual meetings that are effective. Test your technology. Make sure that your camera's working, that your audio is working. You know, we hopped on 30 minutes before the webinar started today to go through everything and make sure. So just testing technology, and also knowing that I mentioned the inequities around access earlier, doing what you can to make sure that everyone attending the meeting has good access to the internet. Reduce ambient and background noise. Yeah, an occasional dog will bark, or a child may come running up with homework that they need help with, and that's great. I actually think it's really making our meetings more human and personal, but just whatever we can to reduce that. Play music while people join. If you can figure out how to do that, I need to learn how to do that because I do lots of meetings. But I think that might be a really fun thing to do. I think you have to maximize your ability to share audio in Zoom if you're using Zoom. Use icebreakers, conduct quizzes, use polls, chat, hand signals. We see people here using some hand signals. Show your pets. Look at that little pug. Isn't he cute? So just doing things that can visually enrich the virtual meeting space. And then take a picture of your shoes. I mentioned that earlier. You can pick something else, but I did that and it was just really successful. So I'm sharing it again. And then have people share a picture of their workspace so you can all kind of see what your environment looks like that you're actually working in now. So those are just a few ideas. And then a couple more: reduce distractions as much as possible. I have a sign on my front door right now, which is over here to the right. That's why I'm pointing to the right. But the sign on the front door just says webinar in progress, please do not disturb. So I'm reducing my distractions with the UPS guy, for example. Give your full attention and be present. So close down all other windows that you have open. Don't check email, don't read the news, don't watch Netflix. Really show up and be present in your meeting, especially if you're having shorter meetings. And that's another thing I want to mention. Unless the meeting requires a lot of time, make your meetings like 15 minutes long. It prevents people from going off on tangents and engaging in conversations that really feel like a waste of time and not on point. And then agree on how to interrupt or make a point in a meeting. So this may be a set of ground rules that you've established for your meetings with your staff or whoever you're meeting with, partners, collaborators, but it's sometimes really hard to interrupt. And I know we have reactions and we can do this. We can raise our hand icon and participants, but making sure that this is agreed upon in advance. And then stretch, like Brigham was saying, doing yoga with staff in the morning, tell jokes, play music, funny hat Fridays, hold a costume contest, celebrate everything, and always make sure that you're conducting one-on-ones with your employees. So don't neglect that. And somebody said that they're doing it once a week. I recommend doing it once a week at least, so that you're checking in and finding out how people are doing. And then just get creative, have fun with it. So there's some really good ideas that have been mentioned in chat. And let's see, what are some fun ways for reminding people that they are off track? Parking lot, they're off track. So conversations during meetings when trying to keep a quick agenda. I would say you want to agree on what this reminder looks like. So it may be that there is a hand signal that you all agree to, or somebody puts in chat, that's a parking lot topic, or just making sure you're acknowledging and making everyone aware. You all are going to have to decide what parking lot items look like, but I would say sometimes it's really obvious, but agreeing on what your hand signal is for parking lot, like maybe it's like something like that. I don't know. But if you agree in advance and you start doing it, people will get used to it, and then that behavior will show up less often. And then some tools that you can use for virtual meetings, which all of you know all of these, I'm sure, but there are many options, and you may be choosing WebEx over Zoom or Google Hangouts over Zoom. Zoom seems to be the go-to for a lot of organizations. Let's talk about similar rules. And what I mean by this is we have similar rules in the virtual workspace as we have in the in-person workspace. So we want to create an agenda and identify a goal or the purpose of the meeting. We want to start on time and we want to end on time. we don't want to allow people to go off subject. So as Marcy asked, figure out a way to make sure that you're acknowledging when somebody has gone off subject and bringing that person or other people that might be involved in the conversation back to the real meaning and purpose of the meeting. Make sure that everyone speaks. So when I am interacting with all of you, and if your cameras were on and we were having an interaction, I would go around the room and call on everybody, and I would make sure that I was noting who hasn't said anything. It's really important. Not everyone's going to speak up and just chime in. So get permission to call on people. Keep things moving. Don't get stuck in a place where you're not making progress. You might want to time your agenda items so that things are flowing and you're limiting the amount of time that you spend on certain topics. And then solicit feedback at the end of the meeting. How did this go? What is one thing that you would change about this meeting to make it better? What did you like the most about this meeting? Just ask a few questions to gauge kind of how people felt about it, and then make adjustments at your next meeting. Yes. All right. So the agenda here are just some tips on the agenda. I think most of you know this. And then there are limits. Lucy Bernholz, who is the director of Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford, she said in an article that I read recently, she's really awesome. You should look her up. She's like amazingly digitally literate, but she said you can't give someone a sandwich over a Zoom call. So just be thinking about how you can personalize and really engage with people. And then there are also benefits. So these are some benefits that might come out of a remote workplace. So thinking about whether or not you're saving money, whether or not you're retaining talent, you're improving the way people are engaged, or even increasing morale. So I want to do a quick poll and find out if any of those items that were on the slide are happening at your organizations. So which benefits that I just quickly went through are you noticing at your organization? And you can select all that apply.
Getting some great feedback. I'm going to give you guys about 10 more seconds. I know there's a lot of things to read. All right, we've got 80% of people have voted.
Great.
I'm going to end that polling and share results.
So interesting, it does look like quite a few of you are seeing an enhancement of staff productivity, which is really nice to know, because I think it might have made a lot of us nervous in the beginning when we started working remotely, because we're not able to really watch over people quite as closely. The second leading response was saving money. So less staff equals less office space. Not necessarily good news for our landlords, but good news for nonprofits on a budget. And then the third is 7 responses, improving employees' engagement and morale. So it's good to know that you're seeing some of the benefits at your organization. And I think if you try some of the things that we shared with you today, it may be that you're enhancing productivity even more. So I put together a list of tools. These are hyperlinked. So when you get the slides after today's webinar, you can just go to these. There's a study that was done by Joseph Grenny and David Maxfield about when remote workers feel left out or shunned. And I talked about this earlier, but that's when my note page got messed up. So I really apologize for that happening, but it's a really good article to read and not a long read. And then 5 tips for better check-ins from the Management Center. So this is an accompanying article to the checklist agenda template that I shared the link to in chat earlier. And then 8 tips for first-time remote workers. That comes from GoToMeeting. And then there's different types of project management software that you may or may not be using, but I thought it might be useful for you to explore these, because you may be wanting to go to the next level, really looking at project management. And then there's a wonderful remote working resource library that the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance put together. This link has a ton of resources. And then there's a guide on remote working from Career Karma. And then we're also sending you another remote working guide when we send the slides that comes from a man named Steve Gravisky, and he's done a lot of research. He's the one that kind of put together that pyramid of the 5 levels of remote working. So I hope these are helpful. And then this is a little graphic that I found from Career Karma. It's in the Career Karma guide that is hyperlinked on the slide. And it just shows kind of 10 ways to be a productive remote worker. And so this might be something that you share with your employees and ask them to keep this handy and to kind of reflect on whether or not they're doing this. And then a final thought that I have that a friend of mine texted me the other day, and I just decided to share it with you all, but that virtual meetings are basically modern seances. So if you think about seances, Elizabeth, are you there? Make a sound if you can hear us. Is anyone else with you? We can't see you. Can you hear us? So this is just kind of a fun way that I wanted to end, just thinking about seances that we used to do as kids and what we would say, seances from the movies, but that's really what a Zoom space can feel like a lot of the time. And I just want to thank you all for all that you do for our communities, for people who are more vulnerable right now and in the world. And if you have any questions or want additional resources, this is my contact information. And thank you all for meeting with us today. Dave, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us as well. And Brigham and Tracy, as always, thank you so much.
Great. So before we wrap up, we've got just a couple of minutes. I do want to pick out 2 door prizes for an hour with Denise. And Tracy has been busy writing people's names a second time. You do have to be present to win. Our first one is Tara Keen. She's Community Connections, and that will be a great.
Oh, great. I've met Tara before. That's wonderful.
And Lindsay Anderson.
Oh, great. This is wonderful. Thank you. I'm so glad that I'm like getting to talk to some people who I've met.
Absolutely. So I do want to just give you guys a quick teaser about our next Chew on This in the series. November 3rd, we are doing Southwest Colorado Gives and your year-end ask. And then we'll do 2 with Sandia Tillotson, who is November 17th, which is Don't Be a Zoom Zombie. Learn bells and whistles to host engaging and interactive virtual meetings and retreats. I think we could all use a way to spice up our Zoom life. And then on December 1st, Sandia will talk about strategic planning in the time of uncertainty. And on December 15th, we'll have Amber Coate from Colorado Nonprofit Association, who is going to do a webinar on board development. So we're really trying to bring you access to trainings so that you can do a quick lunch with us and learn some great information. So both of those people, have you raised your hand or said that you're online? Looks like we've got it. So congratulations, you two. Thank you everybody for joining us. And we are going to end this meeting right on time, sneaking in under the wire. Denise,
thanks everyone.
It was so informative, and I'm sure people really got a lot out of it. And your handouts and your slides are so valuable for people to go back and look again. And Dave, we really appreciate you being our special guest today. All right.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day. Bye.